The Delaware rental laws contain the state's rules for how leases in the states begin and operate, as well as how they end and the eviction process. Understanding these laws is essential for both landlords and tenants because it makes less likely that there will be costly, time-consuming disputes down the line. We're eForms, the world's largest online database of fillable legal forms. In this video, we'll cover topics including the different kinds of lease agreements available in Delaware, requirements on what lease agreements can and cannot contain, and the Delaware eviction process. Check out the description to find a link to a customizable lease agreement that fulfills Delaware requirements. The first thing to know is, where do rental laws come from? Like other states, Delaware has a series of laws that govern different kinds of leases, such as the Residential Landlord-Tenant Code. But the reality is that if you're a landlord or a tenant, the first place you should look is not a law book, but the lease agreement that you signed. A lease is a contract between a landlord and a tenant. The state rental laws set minimum standards for leases, fill in gaps where a lease is ambiguous, and determine what happens when a lease comes to an end, including in an eviction. The next thing you may be wondering is, what kinds of leases does Delaware allow? Delaware allows multiple types of leases, and you can find a sample agreement for each on the eForms page listed in the description. Here are two to be aware of. For residential rentals, a standard lease is the most widely used rental contract in Delaware. It typically covers a 1-year fixed period. Often, when the year concludes, the lease may provide that the lease will become a month-to-month lease, which is an agreement between a landlord and a tenant that renews automatically every month. Either the landlord or the tenant can terminate the lease, but must provide a minimum of 60 days prior to termination as required by law. What else do the rental laws have to say about the terms of lease agreements? They control the security deposit landlords can charge. In Delaware, this can be no more than 1 month's rent. They also require that this deposit be returned no more than 20 days after the lease ends. They control late fees landlords can charge. If a lease agreement calls for a late fee, it cannot be more than 5% of the monthly rent. It also cannot be imposed until rent is at least 5 days late. And they state what information must be provided along with the lease. These are known as required disclosures. Delaware doesn't have as many as some states, but for a complete list, check out the eForms page below. Another thing that the rental laws control, and that is good to include in a lease, is landlord access rules. In Delaware, a landlord is required to provide at least 48 hours notice before entering the property for repairs or any non-emergency reason. When it comes to Delaware's eviction laws, there are 2 legally accepted causes. Non-payment of rent. If the tenant is late on rent, the landlord can issue a 5-day notice to pay or quit. The tenant has 5 days to pay the rent and any penalties or vacate the property. Non-compliance. If the tenant breaks a term of a lease other than failing to pay rent, the landlord may give the tenant 7 days to either comply with the lease or vacate the property. If the tenant fails to correct the problem or vacate, the landlord can begin the eviction process. Because of the time and expense associated with this process, it's generally best to continue to negotiate. If this is impossible, evicting requires a court hearing. If the judge decides in the landlord's favor, the landlord can seek a writ of possession, which empowers a law enforcement body to remove the tenant. Landlords should never try to remove a tenant on their own. Such self-help evictions are always illegal. Understanding Delaware's rental laws is the best way to avoid landlord-tenant disputes. Hit the subscribe button below to find more videos on property law topics you can use in everyday life.